This morning, I hope you guys get the reference. You know, I thought when I came up with the title, Conjunction, Junction, that someone would get that reference. And you know, and someone my age, it was an after-school special, if you guys remember that on PBS, and there was a little song, and I'm not going to sing it, I'm not going to do that to you guys, but I always was fascinated with words that had conditional statements, or sentences that had conditional statements. And I'll use an example. I remember as a young man, and I would beg my mom to do something. Mom, please, if you please just let me go. You know, you guys ever done that? Yes. You guys have ever been on both ends of that? You've been the parent and the one asking the parent, or the grandma or the auntie, whatever. And I've learned very quickly that my mom was very, very quick to say yes. And she'd always start off with a sentence, I'll let you go. But if I find out that you get into trouble, or if I find out that you were up to no good, she always had a condition to allow me to do something. And I used to be horrified because I'd be like, of course I'm going to be up to no good. That's why I asked you, right? But now that I'm a parent and my kids ask me the same thing, I have to say the same thing. I'll let you go, but these are the conditions in which you're allowed to do this. You got to be home by a certain time. You have to text me and let me know if your venue changes. You have to let me know if you're coming home later or early or whatever. And I was always fascinated by conditional statements. And we're going to get into this more. And if you guys would turn to Daniel 3, chapter 3, and just have it ready to go. We're going to go over this chapter, or part of this chapter today. And I want to go into the setup of this story. You guys all know who Nebuchadnezzar was, right? Nebuchadnezzar was a very unique character in the Bible. He was very wicked, right, for a long time in the Bible. And many times he was shown God's power and God's glory and God's deliverance, and he just kept going back to his old ways. And if you guys remember Nebuchadnezzar, he actually, the kingdom of Babylon actually took over the kingdom of Judah, right, and pulled them into and took them captives. You know, and so here one nation goes into another nation and decimates their army, and then takes the people, I guess the people worthy of taking back, the scholars, the scientists, whoever, and he takes those folks back into his kingdom to serve him. Now, if you can imagine, what worse disgrace than to have your nation taken over, and then you're taken captive, and you're actually sent back to this country that has, again, taken everything that you own, taken everything that you have, taken you from the place that you grew up. You can imagine if a nation did that to us and took us from our island here and put us somewhere else. And we could go into the history of Hawaii, and it was kind of done here too. So, but the fact is that this is what Nebuchadnezzar did. He had the biggest army on the earth. He had the biggest kingdom on the earth. And he did what he pleased. That's what Nebuchadnezzar was known for. He would do what he wanted. All right? If you guys remember, he took the captives, and of those captives, Daniel was one of those captives. And if you guys remember the story of Daniel and the diet, as I like to say, remember they wanted him and the other Jewish young men to eat certain things of the king's delicacies, they called them. And Daniel said, we're not going to eat these things. I don't want the pork lau lau. Right? I'm not going to eat that. I'm not going to eat the pork fried rice. I'm not going to eat the bacon. I'm not going to eat the shrimps. I'm not going to eat the crabs. I'm not going to eat these unclean things. Right? And he made a big deal out of it. And finally, when he got a little flack back, remember from the captain, he said, I'll tell you what. He said, we'll eat our normal diet, our vegetarian diet, and you feed your other folks the stuff you normally eat. And we'll see what happens after 10 days or whenever it was. We'll see who's in better shape. Now you can imagine after eating a heavy diet of unclean things and things that weren't meant to be eaten, and then on the other side you have Daniel and his folks eating things that are good for them, you can imagine how at the end of that, who turned out better? You know, I joke, but this is truth. When I was growing up, I used to get a big bag of chicharrones, or fried pork skins. I'd get a big bag of those, about this tall, and I'd get a 2-liter of Mountain Dew, and I'd get my I don't know if you remember those tubs of they'd have like sour cream dip. I eat the whole bag, one sitting, drink the Mountain Dew. I mean, horrible for you, right? But I can tell you, after eating a bag of those, you don't feel like going out and doing exercise, right? You don't feel like going out and doing anything, productive. It zaps the energy right out of you. Your body wasn't meant to eat those things. And so Daniel showed that when you do things by God's way versus the king's way, that God will bless, and their body was made for that. You remember later in Daniel that King Nebuchadnezzar had this troubling dream. And he went to all his people that he consoled with, that he had his council, he had his cabinet members, his trusted people, his soothsayers, his witch doctors, whatever they were. And he said, I want you to tell me, not only do I want you to tell me the dream, I want you to tell me the interpretation. And if you remember, they came back to him and said, King, how can we tell you what the dream was? You haven't told us any details. And then, if we don't know what the dream is, how in the world can we tell you what the interpretation is? And he said, well, how about I kill all of you? All right? And so Daniel goes to the Lord and says, Lord, the king needs to know these things. And so Daniel goes to the captain or whoever he talked to, and he eventually has an audience with the king. And not only does he tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream that he had, he tells him the interpretation. So Nebuchadnezzar actually has seen the power of God. He has seen what happens when you do things his way or God's way. And both times now he's seen that God delivers, that God is the God of gods. But unfortunately, Nebuchadnezzar did not learn from that. And so I want to start with Daniel chapter 3, starting with verse 1. You guys all there?
Yes.
It said, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits, which is a pretty big gold image. That's fairly large, of solid gold. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon, and King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now I want to stop there because I think a lot of times we don't relate well to different times in the Bible. So I want to bring this up to a more modern context. So I'm going to stop, pause every few verses, and I'm going to kind of re-say it in a modern context. You guys okay with that? Okay. So let's try this. The president, whoever it may be, made a gold image and our national bird, the eagle. Okay? So imagine our Congress and our president and everybody agrees that we should pass a law or some kind of legislation saying in order to honor our nation, in order to honor the people who have died defending it, to honor the principles as America that we espouse, we're going to make a gold image in our national bird, which is the bald eagle, right? It's going to be solid gold, and it's going to be a very patriotic thing, right? And so we're going to set up this big ceremony. And all the congressmen and women, the president, all the judges, including the Supreme Court, and all the circuit judges and the federal judges, all the governors are going to be invited, the bankers, all the people that have donated generously to campaigns will be invited. Anybody who's anybody in this nation including our friends in Hollywood, including our friends, our guests maybe from other nations, our allies, will be invited to this dedication, to this very patriotic ceremony, right? This gold eagle that represents America and what it stands for. You can imagine when you have an agreement amongst our politicians to do anything, it's usually no good. So just imagine that, okay? So let's go on to Daniel chapter 3, starting with verse 4. It says, "Then a herald cried aloud, 'To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, that you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of the fiery or the burning fiery furnace.' So at that time, when the people heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and symphony with all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." Now let me take it again to a modern context. So we go back to our nation's government has agreed to set up their gold eagle. And wherever they have the ceremony, whether it's in Washington, D.C. or New York or whatever city they decide to put it up in, most likely D.C., we'd have this big, millions of people. Anytime we've had like a big gathering in Washington, D.C., you can imagine buses and cars just flooding in with people waiting to see this dedication of this thing. You can imagine on the loudspeakers hearing, right? As soon as you hear the guitar, the drums, the bass, all the different modern instruments, you shall pay homage to this golden eagle that we've set up. Again, that represents the values of our great nation. That will show the world that America stands tall amongst everybody else. But if you notice in Daniel that he's calling on their patriotism, right? He's saying, I want you to worship this image of the king. When you hear the music, I want you to bow down and pay its respect, your homage to it. But if that doesn't compel you to do it, to worship, then I have a furnace waiting for you. You see how the king's thinking? In other words, I'll try to get you out of love for me or maybe respect for me, but if that doesn't work, then I'll just try fear. The oven's already heated up. You can see the smoke in the corner of your eye. So there you're standing before the golden image and you have a choice. You either bow or you die. That's your choice. And that's the conditional statement there. He says, and whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now you take it again in the modern context, and you can imagine we've got this great eagle, this beautiful golden eagle, and around the corners of all the peoples that you see, the big massive crowd, you see people with guns and handcuffs waiting to take you away, waiting to put you in a prison, ready to hoodwink you and put you in an armored vehicle and take you to some place where you have no chance of a lawyer, no chance of representation, no chance of getting out. That you'll go to one of our prisons, whether here on our soil or somewhere else, to eventually be executed. So you have that choice. Do you worship? And again, they call on your patriotism. If you love your nation, if you love America, bow down and worship these great ideals. But if that doesn't compel you, we've got officers waiting to escort you to your death. Worship by fear. Continue on in Daniel chapter 3, starting with verse 8. It says, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the provinces of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. You know, unfortunately, there's always part of the crowd that wants to submit. And when they see other people not submitting, that makes them angry. Right? That's one of the reasons that, if you remember, Jesus was hated so much because he did not submit to the authority, and I would say the illegal authority of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because he did not recognize their authority by their own actions, right? By the way that they lived. But there's always that group of people that they blindly follow. They don't question. And then they get mad when you don't do the same thing. And so let me rephrase this in a more modern context. Therefore, at a certain time, these true patriots saw that the remnant was not bowing before the gold image. So the remnant people said, we will not bow. And these patriots, these people who love America, who love the eagle, who love what it represents, who love our flag, who put their hands on their hearts and they sing. They were upset because the remnant would not bow and would not pay homage to the eagle. And they went to the authorities and said, I don't know if you guys saw this, but there's a group. They're all huddled together. They must know each other. They're all huddled together. They must be friends. They must be a group. They must be some kind of cult. But they're not bowing. You better do something about it. They're not patriots. They don't love their nation. They don't love democracy. You know, the funny thing is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was not their name. I believe I preached a message on this before. The same reason we don't call Daniel Belshazzar. That was his Babylonian name. We call him Daniel. We call him by his Hebrew name because the Hebrew name always pointed people to God. But the Babylonian name was actually an offensive name because it actually referenced their gods. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, actually their name was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That was their real name. So not only were they taken into a captivity into another nation, they were given new names that were blasphemous. Can you imagine every day instead of someone calling you by your given name of birth, they called you by a name that was given to a foreign god? Would that bother you? If every day I went into work, instead of being called Jonathan, I was called Baal, or I was called whatever other gods are worshipped on this earth, that would offend me. And every time I'm greeted in the streets, every time I go into the marketplace, every time I'm officially announced for anything, they call me by a name that actually uplifts another god, a false god. The fact is these young men weren't good patriots. They didn't love their nation. What do you mean you're not going to bow down before the gold statue? You don't love Babylon? You don't love your nation? You don't love what it stands for? We're the most powerful nation on the earth. You don't like that? You're not going to bow? You know, it's funny. We always point to other people's idolatry and think how horrible it is. And we don't look at our own. You don't think we don't have gods, other gods in this nation? The Lord said, do not make any image of anything, any creation. And yet everywhere we go, we'll see the golden eagles. Well, and friends, I love my nation. I love America and I pray for it. But the fact is our citizenship lies in heaven. That's our permanent citizenship. We are transient right now. And we'll get more into this, why this is important. Continuing with verse 13. It says, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them, saying, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now, if you are ready at this time to hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? So he was not happy at this point. And so he gives them another chance. I understand that you guys aren't from here. You guys weren't born citizens of Babylon. Maybe you don't understand how we do things here. I'll make it clear again. You hear the music, you bow. Simple as that. And if you don't, in the oven you go. Now, if we take it into a more modern context, you can imagine that, again, we have a group of people on the national lawn that doesn't want to bow down to our gold eagle. And then some patriots, some true patriots that saw the disrespect that they were paying to our great nation, went and told the authorities, and the authorities brought these young people, or these people, whoever they are, the remnant people, up to the authorities and said, maybe you guys don't understand how we do things here. Maybe you don't understand the gravity of what we're asking you to do. We'll try this again. When you hear the music, when you hear the Star-Spangled Banner play, you better be a patriot. Because we got some cars, we got some buses ready to take you away. We may not be able to fit you in Guantanamo, but we have other places we can put you for sure. Again, but if you do not worship. Worship by fear. Again. We see this constantly. This Nebuchadnezzar uses this. We saw it earlier in Daniel when I kind of alluded when he had the dream and he couldn't get his soothsayers and his magicians to interpret the dream. He thought, well, maybe I'll just threaten to kill everybody. And maybe that'll work. And so I'll ask you guys this question. Is worship by fear truly worship? Who would say yes? That if you worship, it doesn't matter why you do it. Does it matter? Does it matter the intention behind the worship? In other words, do you do it willingly or unwillingly? A lot of people will do things unwillingly out of fear, but given the choice, they wouldn't do it. You can imagine, again, if we were in that situation and we were given the choice of doing what we know is wrong or death. You know, we like to believe we would be like these young men and choose death. But when it comes down to it, unless you're on the spot like that and you know what's going to happen, God help us, right? Continuing in verse 16. And I love this. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. That gives me chills when I read that. They know what the command is. They know the consequences of what will happen when they effectively tell the king to his face, no. Now you imagine in a more modern context that you're brought before the highest judges, even maybe before the president or Congress itself, and it's explained to you what your choice is. You either bow down to the great golden eagle or off you go. The manner and method of which you die is unknown to you. You may be shot, you may be poisoned, you may be whatever, but you know either way you're going to die. And the remnant has that choice, whether they go along with it or they don't. But you can imagine God's people standing up and saying, we don't fear your prisons. We don't fear your military might. We don't fear your officers of the law. Who we fear is God. And we know that our God can deliver us from your prisons, can deliver us from your execution table. But even if He chooses not to, we're still not going to worship your idol. Now that is faith. It is faith to say, I know God can save me, and He will, but even if He chooses not to, in other words, even if He allows me to experience death and some pain and suffering before I die, I'm still not going to do it. We talked this morning, I heard Dan talk about faith and Uncle talk about faith this morning in Sabbath school. And to have the faith in a God to say, I love Him so much and I trust Him so much that regardless of whether He saves me or not, I'm still going to go through to the end. Now, friends, I'm comparing the two stories, and sometimes we think how far-fetched it is, but it's not. If you have not looked at our nation and thought it is getting increasingly more hostile towards people who want to follow God and not follow government. It is increasingly more hostile. It's not just people wanting you to obey, it's wanting you to conform. They want not only you to conform in your actions, they want you to conform in your thoughts. People get upset when you think differently than everybody else. They don't want you to even think differently. It's scary times. And we think, how in the world could this ever happen? But we know through prophecy it will happen. We will be given a choice. We will be given a choice between worshiping the beast, the Antichrist power, or we'll be given the choice of worshiping God. And it may come to this. It may come to where they're ready to cart us off on the spot. I hope none of us have to go through that, but it's possible. It's very possible. But these three young men, you can imagine, they're standing alone. There's only three of them. Of all the crowd, of all the people, of all the nations, of all the different types of administrators they had in that crowd, they were the only three that stood up. Sometimes people don't realize the pressure sometimes is greater from the crowd than it is from the death. You see your neighbor, you see your best friend, you see your spouse bowing, and you know better, and you're like, I'm not bowing. I don't care who bows next to me. I don't care if it's my pastor. I don't care if it's the conference president. I don't care if it's the whole denomination. I will stand. That is faith. That means you love the Lord more than you love being an Adventist. That means you love the Lord more than you do your neighbor. That means you love the Lord more than you do your nation or your king or whoever has been appointed above you. That is faith. I'd like to think that I have that kind of faith, but until it's tested, God has to test us sometimes. Job was tested. And if you remember at the end of Job, God went to his friends and said, you have not spoken well of me, but Job has. Take to him a sacrifice, and I'll hear his prayer. Job was tested through the fire, and he actually became a type of Christ for his friends. But it took them going through the fire, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But again, the conditional statement. But if not, even if God does not deliver us from death, we still will not fall and worship. I love that. And I just want to summarize real quick. I promised my friends I wouldn't go too long today. So, just some thoughts. The first thought is that Nebuchadnezzar struggled with something we all struggle with, which is pride. And sometimes we look at people, maybe in people in power. You know, recently we've had a big thing here in Hawaii. We have a trial going on of some people. And we don't understand sometimes that temptations are different for different sets of people and different personalities. Sometimes a person who lives in poverty doesn't have the same temptation as someone who lives in riches. And I use the example always of young athletes. You know, you got a 19-year-old, you got some 19-year-old basketball players that soon will be millionaires. You take a 19-year-old kid and you give them fame and fortune and you give them a lot of money, now all of a sudden they have access to sins they didn't have access to before. They've got girls. They don't have to go out and look for girls, the girls look for them. They don't have to go out and look for drugs, drugs look for them. They don't have to go out and look for people who are going to try to get them in trouble. Those people will come to them. And so, when you have a king that has all power on the earth, in other words, he has the biggest nation on the planet, he has the biggest army, he can do what he wants, say what he wants, and get away with whatever he wants. Can you imagine if you were given that kind of power? I'd have a bad attitude too. And I'm thankful that God has not put me in that position because I'd fail miserably. I'd probably be worse than Nebuchadnezzar. And I think a lot of us would agree that we would. But you take a man who is not used to being told no, and he runs with it. And then all of a sudden you got these three boys that say, I don't think so, king. There's a God that's higher than you. And of course Nebuchadnezzar was not happy with that. Proverbs 16, 18 through 19 says this, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. And you know, when I put this in the message today, I had to think about who wrote that. Who wrote Proverbs? Solomon. You think Solomon struggled with pride? It's another king that had everything handed to him. And he knew the temptation of what happens when you're not used to being told no. When you're given everything under the sun. When you're given riches and power and glory. And what did he do with that? Did he walk away from God? So the funny thing is, we look at Nebuchadnezzar and we say, what a horrible man. But the fact is, he had no balance. He had no God that he could look back to. He wasn't raised in a nation that espoused God and learned about the principles of God. Solomon did. And Solomon still fell. That shows you the temptation of these things. That Nebuchadnezzar struggled with pride. That's something we all struggle with. Another topic that kind of touches a little bit in this story is when the world takes purview over the law of God. There was a time, at least, that we paid some homage to the laws of God in this nation. We no longer do that. The law of God has been obliterated, even in our own laws. We have laws that supersede what God has explicitly said not to do. If you ever want to know when probation runs out for a nation, it's when they officially sign off on something that goes against what God has said. It's one thing when the Israelites individually sinned and turned away from God and did these things and followed idols. But when they did it corporately, in other words, they said, we have no king but Caesar, God has no choice at that point but to say it's over. You have officially chosen someone else. You have signed the papers of your own death warrant. And when the world or our nation passes laws that supersede the laws of God, in other words, they cause the individual or compel the individual to violate the laws of God, which in this case the law of God is what? What was it for Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego? What was the law they were asking to be violated? To worship idols. So God said, do not worship idols. Don't have any idols, I'm your only God. And Nebuchadnezzar said, you are to bow before this. This is a law, in other words, in my kingdom. So the two now conflict. If you would turn with me to Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, verse 8. And this is the answer that Christ gives the devil when the devil presents him with the same situation. Matthew chapter 4, starting with verse 8. You guys just say amen when you're there. It says, again the devil took him up on an exceedingly high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these things I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me. Remember, conditional again. If you fall down and worship me, I will give you these things. And of course Jesus answered him and said, away with you, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. The devil thought that it was his to give. And secondly, he tried to compel Christ to worship him to get it. And what he didn't understand was Christ was going to get it back either way. And not through breaking the law of God. So when we have a situation where we have a choice between violating the law of God or violating the law of man, there we have it. What do we choose? The difference is that God gives us a choice. Man does not. You see what the king, what he used as a means to get worship. He used a threat. Whereas God says, I give you freedom of choice. You can choose to do this. And these are the consequences that you will have. But it's still your choice. I give you the freedom to worship me, or I give you the freedom to worship whatever else. And this brings me to my final point. The fear of man is conditional, but faith in God is unconditional. I'll say it again. The fear of man is conditional, but the faith in God is unconditional. But if God chooses not to save us, we still will be faithful. If God chooses not to let me have something, or God chooses to take something away from me, I will remain faithful. Then He knows what He's doing. That is the very definition of faith. Whereas man does not operate that way. Our nation does not operate that way. What happens when we have a disagreement with another nation? What usually follows that disagreement? Some kind of punitive action, some kind of threat. We have that with China right now. We're not happy with the trade, and I'm not going to, comment either way, whether it's right or wrong. But the fact is we say, okay, we can't come to agreement. This is the punitive action I'm going to take to compel you to agree with me. This is how the world works. This is how business works sometimes. This is how humans are programmed. You've heard the term, the president said, walk softly and carry a big stick. You guys ever heard that? In other words, you tread lightly, but they know you got that stick just in case. That is not the way God operates. That's not the way He wants our faith to operate. He wants us to trust Him and love Him. He doesn't want us to fear Him that if we don't love Him or we don't worship Him, that He's going to zap us. Unfortunately, our Protestant brothers and sisters teach that. They teach that eternal hell doctrine, one of the most insidious evil doctrines ever invented by the evil mankind, is that this loving God who would give heaven and earth to save His creation, but if you don't worship Him, He will punish you indefinitely. You see how man's mind is corrupted? That's how they think. That's how the world thinks. Can you imagine if I went home and told my wife, if you love me, great. But if you don't, I got a gun ready. And there's guys that do that, unfortunately. Is that love? No. And just to summarize, we live in a world that's increasingly more hostile, like Babylon was, to the things of God. And we're being increasingly put in these situations where we have a choice. Do we follow what God says, or do we follow what man says? And right now the consequences, at least in America, aren't as dire as death. But they are getting to the point where we are being effectively told you can't do business, or you can't worship, or you can't do this or that, or you won't be part of our group, or you won't be part of this or that. It's becoming increasingly punitive. And eventually it's going to get to the point where we're given a choice. You either are with us or you die. But we know that we serve a God that saves. And next week I'm going to follow up and finish the end of the story and go into the next chapter, because I want to continue this, because I love Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar, when I read the stiff-necked people in the Bible, I always thought it was talking about me. And I can relate to Nebuchadnezzar. Because Nebuchadnezzar took, how many times did it take? How much did God have to show him before he accepted? But there's hope in this story. There's hope that this man that thought he could compel worship by fear, that he could get these young Hebrew boys by the threat of the oven to violate God and His law, was unable to do so. And the whole time, not only was God delivering Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, He was also trying to deliver Nebuchadnezzar. Because we serve a God that loves us all, and He's trying to save us all, from the biggest stiff-necked heathen down to the righteous person. He's trying to get us all in the same umbrella, right? So next week we'll continue with part 2, which will be the finishing up of this particular chapter and going into the next chapter, and see the deliverance that God brings to everybody involved. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the blessings of your mercy, that you are very long-suffering, that you, if it takes 100 times to show us, then you'll take 100 times. And I want to thank you that you don't give up on us. We want to thank you for this example of these 3 boys. They stood up and they provided an example, and you delivered them. And we ask that you give us the same faith. In your name we pray. Amen.